Hi, my name is Stanley, and this is Old Money Life. Imagine building something so beloved that millions of people would genuinely argue, and I mean argue, with the kind of passion most people reserve for religion and football, that it is the greatest burger on the planet. Now imagine that the man who built it never lived to see it reach its full glory, dying in a fiery plane crash just 17 years after he opened the doors. And imagine that the family he left behind spent the next 5 decades holding on for dear life before finally letting go of the only thing that still connected them to him. That is the Whataburger story, and I have been sitting on this one for 6 months because I wanted to make absolutely sure I got every single detail right before sharing it with you. The man with the big idea. Now, before we talk about tragedy, we need to talk about genius. You cannot fully understand what was lost until you understand exactly what was built, and more importantly, who built it. Harmon Dobson was born in 1922 in Nashville, Tennessee, and from everything the historical record tells us, he was the kind of man who made a room feel different the moment he walked into it. There is a particular type of entrepreneur, and I have studied enough of them at this point to recognize the pattern immediately, who does not just see opportunity where others see nothing, but who is almost physically incapable of walking past it without doing something about it. Harmon Dobson was that man. By his early 20s, he was already a carnival and fair operator, which I personally think is one of the most fascinating details of this entire story. This detail is what made me fall in love with this story in the first place, because what does a carnival operator understand better than almost anyone else in the world? He understands foot traffic. He understands impulse. He understands the art of making a stranger stop walking, look twice, and reach into his pocket. That is not a small skill set. That is, in many ways, the entire foundation of the fast food industry distilled into one man's lived experience. By the late 1940s, Dobson had drifted into the oil business in Texas, which was not an unusual path for an ambitious young man in that era. But it was in Corpus Christi, Texas, that he had the idea that would change everything. He had noticed something that sounds almost embarrassingly simple in hindsight, that the hamburgers being served at most American diners and drive-ins in 1949 and 1950 were, frankly, small. They were serviceable, they were fine, but they were not remarkable. And Harmon Dobson was not a man who had much patience for fine. His idea was almost childishly audacious. He wanted to make a burger so large, so genuinely, absurdly generous, that when a customer took their first bite, their involuntary reaction would be to say the words out loud, "What a burger!" He did not just want to sell food. He wanted to produce a spontaneous, unscripted word-of-mouth advertising campaign every single time a customer unwrapped his product. I will be honest, when I first came across this, I was convinced it could not possibly be true. I had to go verify it myself. And it is absolutely true. The name was not a marketing slogan cooked up in some boardroom. It was a prediction, a very confident prediction from a very confident man. On August 5, 1950, Harmon Dobson opened the very first Whataburger stand on Ayers Street in Corpus Christi, Texas. The burger cost 30 cents. It was a full 5 inches in diameter, enormous by the standards of the day. And on that first day alone, he sold over 300 burgers. That is not a modest opening. That is a statement. Building something from nothing. What followed over the next decade and a half was the kind of relentless, grinding, brick-by-brick expansion that the great American business origin stories are almost always made of, and almost always underreported in favor of the more glamorous chapters that come later. I went down such a deep rabbit hole on this period that my wife had to physically take my laptop away from me at midnight on a Tuesday. So forgive me if I get a little enthusiastic here. Dobson franchised his first location in Alice, Texas in 1951, just 1 year after opening his original stand. And here is where his genius reveals itself in a second, equally important dimension. Because franchising in 1951 was not the well-understood, legally codified business model it would later become. Dobson was operating on instinct, on personal relationships, and on an absolute conviction that his product was different enough to warrant replication. He was right. Throughout the 1950s, Whataburger locations began appearing across South Texas, and then gradually throughout the broader Southwest. But what I find most remarkable about this expansion is not the speed of it, it is the consistency of it. Because Harmon Dobson was a perfectionist of the first order, he understood, almost before the vocabulary existed to describe it, what we would now call brand integrity. Every Whataburger had to taste the same. Every Whataburger had to look the same. Every customer at every location had to have the same experience. And this is the part where, every single time I tell this story, I get goosebumps, and I've told it probably 100 times. Because in the mid-1950s, Dobson introduced the orange and white striped A-frame building design that would become one of the most recognizable architectural silhouettes in the American South and Southwest. That building was not just a restaurant. It was a landmark. It was a signal. It said, from a distance, before you could even read the sign, "This is a place worth stopping for." Drive through Texas today, and those buildings still produce a Pavlovian response in anyone who grew up anywhere near them. That is not an accident. That is the long shadow of Harmon Dobson's obsessive visual intelligence. By the mid-1960s, Whataburger had over 40 locations and was generating the kind of revenue that placed it firmly in the conversation of serious American regional empires. The McDonald's brothers had already sold their company to Ray Kroc. Burger King was expanding nationally. The fast food wars were beginning in earnest, and Harmon Dobson, carnival operator, oil man, South Texas dreamer, was right in the middle of it, building something that felt genuinely different from everything else in the category. He was 44 years old. He was at the absolute peak of his powers. And then August came. The day the sky fell. I actually called my mom after learning the details of this chapter. She grew up in South Texas in the 1960s, and I just knew that she had lived through exactly this moment in history. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what I was researching. There was a pause, and then she said quietly that she remembered it. She said people cried, not just employees, not just business partners, regular people. People who had never once shaken Harmon Dobson's hand, never stood in the same room as him, never knew anything about him beyond the fact that his burger was the best thing they had ever put in their mouth. Those people cried. That detail has stayed with me every single day since she told me. On August 11th, 1967, Harmon Dobson was piloting his own plane near Corpus Christi when it went down. He was killed on impact. He was 44 years old. I want you to just sit with that number for a second. 44. Because in 1967, Whataburger had been alive for exactly 17 years. The company had over 40 locations spread across the South and Southwest. It was profitable. It was growing at a rate that would have made his competitors deeply uncomfortable. It had the kind of brand recognition, that specific earned emotional brand recognition, that most fast food executives spend entire careers chasing without ever finding. And the man who had personally conceived of every single element of it, the name, the size, the buildings, the obsessive quality standards, the entire soul of the thing, was gone. Instantly. Without warning. Without a transition plan. Without a goodbye. This is one of those things I find myself randomly thinking about at 2 in the morning, and it just refuses to leave me alone. Because the particular cruelty here is not simply that a man died young, as devastating as that is on its own terms. The cruelty is the timing. Harmon Dobson had already done the hardest part. He had stared down the blank page and filled it. He had proven the concept, built the infrastructure, created the culture, and genuinely earned, the right to now sit back and watch everything he had planted finally bloom at full scale. The greatest years of Whataburger, the years of maximum growth and maximum cultural impact, were almost certainly still ahead of him in 1967. He never got to see them. He left behind Grace Dobson, his wife, and their children. He left behind a company mid-expansion, carrying all the financial complexity and operational weight that implies. He left behind an entire team of people who had built their professional lives around his vision and his judgment. And he left behind a question that absolutely nobody in that building knew how to answer when they came into work on the morning of August 12, 1967. What happens now? Grace Dobson, the woman who refused to let it die. Most people gloss over this part. And I think that is, and I want to be direct about this, a genuine injustice, because what Grace Dobson did in the years and decades that followed her husband's death is, in my personal opinion, one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of American family business. Full stop. Grace Dobson had not been positioned as a business executive. She had not been groomed for the operational leadership of a multi-location fast food franchise. She was a widow with children, suddenly in possession of a company that required daily, expert, high-stakes decisions. And the entire world, I suspect, was watching to see if she would simply sell it. She did not sell it. I have been obsessed with stories like this since I was a kid, the person who refuses to fold when every rational observer expects them to. There is something about that specific type of human stubbornness that I find almost cosmically moving, and Grace Dobson was a world-class practitioner of it. Under her leadership through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Whataburger did not contract. It did not stall. It grew. The company expanded deeper into Texas, then into neighboring states, then gradually across a broader swath of the American South. By the 1980s, Whataburger had crossed the 100-location threshold. By the 1990s, it had surpassed 500. The orange and white stripes were appearing in Florida, Arizona, New Mexico, Georgia, a regional empire of genuinely impressive scale, all built on the foundation that Harmon Dobson had laid and that Grace Dobson had refused to let crumble. Now, I want to be careful here because I think it would be a disservice to Grace to frame her story as simply the story of a widow preserving her husband's legacy. That framing, however well-intentioned, subtly diminishes her own agency and intelligence. Grace Dobson was not a caretaker. She was an operator. She made real decisions, unpopular decisions, strategic decisions, including reportedly resisting numerous acquisition offers from larger national chains who could see exactly what she had built and wanted to absorb it. I printed out over 200 pages of research for this story. My desk genuinely looked like a crime scene investigation board, and what struck me most consistently about the accounts of Grace's tenure is how often the word stubborn appears in the context of praise. Her stubbornness was a feature, not a bug. It was the thing that kept Whataburger in the Dobson family when market logic might have suggested otherwise. She remained central to the company well into her later years, and under her watch, Whataburger became something that transcends the category of fast food restaurant. It became a cultural institution, a point of regional pride, a place that Texans and Southerners feel a genuine, almost irrational, emotional ownership over. If you have never witnessed a Texan become incensed at the suggestion that their local Whataburger is just another fast food chain, well, I envy you that experience, because it is spectacular. The children inherit the kingdom. Here is where the story becomes, for me, deeply personal in a way I cannot entirely explain. I grew up in a family that had a small business, nothing on the scale of Whataburger, not even remotely. But I understand viscerally what it means to inherit not just a company, but a story. And the weight of that story can be suffocating in ways that outsiders almost never appreciate. The second generation of Dobsons, Harmon's children, stepped into leadership roles through the 1980s and into the 90s, with Tom Dobson eventually becoming a central figure in the company's operations and direction. And by every measurable standard, they did an admirable job. The company continued to grow. The brand continued to strengthen. The customer loyalty that Harmon and Grace had cultivated showed no sign of erosion. But here is the thing about second-generation family businesses that I find endlessly fascinating and, if I'm being honest, a little heartbreaking to study. The founder creates the company out of nothing, out of pure willpower and vision, and the act of creation itself is the fuel that sustains them through every difficult moment. The second generation inherits the company in full operation, with all of its obligations, its existing culture, its established identity, and must find a way to feel genuine ownership over something they did not build from scratch. That is a profoundly different psychological challenge, and not everyone is equally equipped to navigate it. This is the kind of thing that, once you see it, completely changes how you understood everything that came before it. By the late 1990s and the early 2000s, Whataburger was a company of genuine scale. The employee count ran into the tens of thousands. Annual revenue was measured in the billions. The operational complexity of managing a food service empire of that magnitude, including supply chains, real estate, marketing, technology infrastructure, and competitive positioning against McDonald's and Burger King, and an increasingly crowded fast food landscape, was a full-time professional challenge for a team of seasoned executives. And the Dobson family, for all of their commitment to the company, was navigating a transition that every successful family business eventually faces. The moment when the question shifts from how do we grow this to can we afford to keep it? There are no villains in this chapter. I want to be absolutely clear about that. The Dobson family's stewardship of Whataburger across 3 generations was, and I do not use this word lightly, remarkable. But the forces gathering around them in the 2000s and the early 20-teens were of a scale that tested even the most committed family dynasties. The sale that broke 1 million hearts. Okay, this is the chapter I have been building toward for this entire script, and I want to take a breath before I tell you about it, because honestly, it still gets to me. In June of 2019, the Dobson family announced that they had agreed to sell a majority stake in Whataburger to BDT Capital Partners, a Chicago-based private equity firm. The Dobson family would retain a minority stake and remain involved in an advisory capacity. But effective control of Whataburger, the company that Harmon Dobson had staked his entire life savings on in 1950, that Grace Dobson had kept alive through the darkest days of widowhood, that 2 subsequent generations of Dobsons had expanded into a beloved American institution, passed out of family hands for the first time in 69 years. I've shown this story to friends who had zero interest in the topic, and every single one of them stopped scrolling when they got to this part. The public reaction was, in a word, visceral. Social media responses from lifelong Whataburger customers ranged from genuine grief to theatrical outrage, to the kind of dark humor people deploy when they are processing something they do not quite have the emotional vocabulary for. Texans, in particular, treated it with the solemnity typically reserved for the passing of a beloved public figure. Because in a very real sense, that is what it was. Whataburger was not just a burger chain to the people who grew up with it. It was a memory. It was a road trip, and a late night after prom, and the first meal after coming home from a long time away. And the Dobson family had been the custodians of all of those memories for nearly 7 decades. Now, I want to be very careful here, because I think it would be unfair and frankly irresponsible to frame this sale as a failure. It was not a failure. The Dobson family had built a company worth an estimated $5 billion by 2019. They had taken 30 cents and an audacious idea and created $5 billion of enterprise value across 3 generations. That is not a tragedy in the conventional sense. That is, by almost any rational measure, an astonishing success. But here is what I personally think, and I have thought about this quite a lot, is the tragic dimension of this story. The sale was almost certainly not what the family wanted. It was, in all probability, what they ultimately concluded they had to do. Running a $5 billion fast food enterprise after 2010 was an undertaking that required levels of capital investment in technology, in infrastructure, in competitive marketing, in supply chain modernization that even a wealthy family operation struggles to finance organically. The business had, in some ways, grown beyond the financial capacity of the family that owned it to sustain it at the level the market now demanded. This is one of those things that I find genuinely difficult to sit with. The very success of what Harmon and Grace Dobson built is, in a certain light, what made it impossible for their family to keep it forever. The bigger it got, the more capital it required. The more capital it required, the more pressure accumulated on a family that was, at its core, a family, not a publicly traded institution with access to unlimited debt and equity markets. There is something about this dynamic that I cannot quite put into words, which almost never happens to me. BDT Capital Partners, to their credit, maintained much of what made Whataburger distinctive in the immediate aftermath of the acquisition. The menu remained largely intact. The orange and white buildings remained. The regional identity remained. But the announcement in 2020 that Whataburger would be expanding into Kansas City, Missouri, its first location outside its traditional southern and southwestern footprint, signaled clearly that the new ownership had a different vision for the brand's trajectory. Expansion, nationalization, maximum market penetration. The language of private equity applied to something that had always derived its power precisely from its regional specificity. Whether that is right or wrong, and is, I think, genuinely above my pay grade to adjudicate. But I know what it felt like to an entire generation of customers. It felt like something had ended. What was lost and what remains? I want to close this story the way I think it deserves to be closed. Not with numbers and valuations, but with something closer to what this whole thing actually means. Harmon Dobson died in 1967 at 44 years old, having spent 17 years building something genuinely original. Grace Dobson spent the rest of her life ensuring that his work was not erased. Their children spent their careers honoring the standards that both of those people had set. And eventually, faced with the mathematical realities of operating a $5 billion enterprise in an era of maximum corporate competition, the family made the only decision that probably made rational sense: and let go. This is a topic I avoided for a long time, honestly, because it made me uncomfortable. Stories about families losing control of what they built have always hit me in a particular way that I find difficult to entirely explain. Maybe it is because I believe, more than most people I know, that the human element in a business is not a soft, secondary consideration. It is the whole point. It is the reason the 30-cent burger on Ayr Street in Corpus Christi hit different from every other burger in 1950. It was made by a person who had a specific, original vision. And when the person is gone, when the family is gone, something real and irreplaceable leaves with them. Now listen, Whataburger still exists. The burgers are still large. The buildings are still orange and white. mostly. If you drive through Texas today, you can still pull off the highway and order a Whataburger at 2 in the morning, which remains one of the great privileges available to the American traveler. And I say that with complete sincerity. But here is what I personally think is the most underrated part of this entire story. And I want to leave you with this because I think it reframes everything we have covered today. The tragedy of Whataburger is not that the company died. It did not die. The tragedy is that the story of the Dobson family, Harmon's audacity, Grace's resilience, the children's devotion, will inevitably fade from public consciousness as the brand continues under its new ownership. Because brands without families tend to lose their mythology over time. They become logos. They become marketing campaigns. They become real estate footprints and revenue projections. And the mythology of Whataburger, the specific, particular, irreplaceable mythology of a man who stood outside a small stand in Corpus Christi and predicted that the burger he was about to hand you was going to make you say, "What a burger," out loud. That mythology deserves to be told and retold. Not because it changes anything, but because stories like this are how we remember what business at its best actually looks like. Personal, obsessive, deeply, stubbornly human. I've been sitting on this story for 6 months, and I still don't think I've done it full justice. But I'm glad I finally got it out. And now, I would genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. If you grew up eating Whataburger, I want to know what it meant to you, and whether you think the sale to BDT Capital was the inevitable end of an era, or whether you believe the soul of the brand can survive without the family behind it. I read every single comment on this channel, and this is one where I am truly curious what you think. As always, thank you so much for spending your time here on Old Money Life. I do not take it for granted for a single second. My name is Stanley. Cheers until next time.